They say finding love is hard. But finding love for a 623-year-old vampire king who thinks tax policy is appropriate first date conversation? That's nearly impossible. George Knight, vampire king of the Northern Territories, had a problem. He'd conquered kingdoms, amassed fortunes, and survived countless wars, but he could not, for the life, or unlife, of him, get through a single dinner with a potential bride without her running away screaming. Not because he was a vampire. Most noble families knew about vampires and were fine with it for the political alliance. No, they ran away because George Knight had the romantic skills of a brick wall. His last courtship attempt had ended with the lady throwing her wine in his face after he spent 2 hours explaining his kingdom's tax system in excruciating detail. The one before that had actually fallen asleep at the dinner table, her face nearly landing in her soup. The one before that had fled halfway through the appetizer course, claiming a sudden illness that fooled absolutely no one. His advisors were in a panic. The kingdom desperately needed an alliance with the Southern Territories. Without it, trade routes would close, political tensions would escalate, and the fragile peace they'd maintained for decades could shatter. The vampire king needed a bride. They needed help. Professional help. That's where Emma Hartwell came in. Emma ran happily ever after matchmaking services from a tiny office above a bakery in the city, just 20 minutes from the castle, though the two worlds felt centuries apart. She was brilliant at her job. She'd matched over 200 couples, had an 87% success rate, and could spot romantic compatibility from a mile away. For other people, that is. For herself, Emma was convinced she was fundamentally unmatchable. She could read anyone else's love story perfectly. The right matches, the wrong timing, the missing pieces that would make everything click. Just never her own. She was plus-sized in a world that celebrated tiny. She was loud in a world that valued demure. She was clumsy in a world that prized grace. She was confident in her work, but deeply insecure about herself as a romantic prospect. She was, by her own assessment, everything a royal bride should absolutely not be. But she had a gift for seeing what people actually needed versus what they thought they wanted. And she'd built a moderately successful business on that gift, even if she couldn't seem to apply it to her own life. Her business was struggling, though. 3 major clients had canceled in the past month. Rent was overdue. She was 2 months away from having to close her doors and find a regular job. The thought made her stomach turn. Matchmaking wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. When the Vampire King's representative showed up at her office with an obscene amount of money and a desperate request, Emma's first instinct was to say no. Matching a Vampire King? That was way above her pay grade, and the political stakes were enormous. This wasn't just about finding love. It was about saving a kingdom. Then the representative named a figure. A check large enough to save her business for 5 years, maybe more. Emma said yes. That decision would change everything. Emma expected the Vampire King to be intimidating, powerful, perhaps a bit pompous. She was not wrong about any of those things. What she didn't expect was to make the worst first impression of her entire professional career. The throne room was massive, all dark wood and stone, with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered the afternoon light into pools of color on the marble floor. Very dramatic, very intimidating. very much not designed for a nervous matchmaker carrying an overstuffed portfolio. Emma had practiced her entrance. Confident stride, professional smile, firm handshake. She'd rehearsed it 17 times in her apartment that morning. She made it approximately 6 steps before her heel caught on absolutely nothing, and she went down hard. Her portfolio flew from her hands, papers scattering everywhere like oversized confetti. Client files, compatibility charts, and carefully organized notes on eligible noble ladies spread across the pristine marble floor in complete chaos. Emma's face burned with embarrassment as she scrambled to pick them up. A paper with a duchess's profile slid past her reaching fingers. She lunged for it, nearly face-planting again in the process. "Your Highness," she muttered, grabbing papers with both hands. "I'm so sorry, Your Highness. Just give me one moment." "It's Your Majesty, actually," a deep voice said from the throne. Not unkind, just correcting. Emma froze. Oh no, wrong title. She'd used the wrong title. "Your Majesty," she blurted out, then immediately realized that wasn't even a word. "I mean, Your Majesty, obviously. Your Majesty, that's what I meant." She finally managed to gather most of her papers into a wrinkled pile and stood up, clutching them to her chest like a shield. That's when she actually looked at George Knight for the first time. Oh no. He was gorgeous. Unfairly, devastatingly gorgeous. Dark hair that looked like he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. Sharp, aristocratic features that could have been carved from marble. And eyes. Gray eyes that looked like they'd seen centuries. Because they had. Eyes that currently held a mixture of confusion and what might have been amusement. He sat on his throne looking utterly baffled, his head tilted slightly as he studied her, like he couldn't quite believe she was, supposedly, the kingdom's best matchmaker. Emma's face turned redder by the second. The advisors flanking the throne looked equally bewildered. One of them whispered something to another, probably wondering if it was too late to cancel the contract and find someone more competent. Emma had 2 choices: crumble under the embarrassment or own it completely. She'd learned a long time ago that when you embarrass yourself, confidence is your only weapon. She straightened her shoulders, looked George Knight dead in the eye, and said the first honest thing that came to mind. "Okay, let's be honest. You're a disaster at romance, or you wouldn't need me. I'm clearly a disaster at first impressions. So let's skip the formalities and get to work. Why did the last 6 women run away from you?" The throne room went completely silent. The kind of silence where you can hear dust settling. The advisors looked like they might faint. Apparently, no one had spoken to the Vampire King this directly in about 200 years. George Knight stared at her for a long moment. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, but she held his gaze. Then he smiled. Just a small quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it was definitely there. "You're right," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. "I am a disaster at romance. That's exactly why you're here. Please, sit down. Let's talk." One of the advisors rushed to bring a chair. Emma sat, smoothing her wrinkled papers on her lap, trying to look more professional than she felt. "So," George said, leaning forward slightly, "tell me how this works." Emma took a deep breath, falling into the familiar rhythm of her job. This part she knew. This part she was good at. First, I need to understand what you're looking for. Not what the kingdom needs, what you need. Then I'll create a profile, search my database, and introduce you to compatible candidates. I'll coach you through the courtship process, help you make a good impression, and hopefully, we'll find you a bride within 6 months. Coach me? George raised an eyebrow. Yes, coach you. Because based on what I've heard, you desperately need coaching. One of the advisors made a strangled sound. George's smile widened. What have you heard? That you spent an entire date discussing tax policy. That you compared a woman unfavorably to your ex-wife during dinner. That you've had 6 failed courtships in as many months. Emma ticked them off on her fingers. Should I continue? No, that about covers it, George admitted. He didn't even look embarrassed. More resigned. Like he'd accepted this was simply who he was. So yes, Emma said firmly, you need coaching. I'll teach you what works, what doesn't, how to actually connect with someone instead of boring them into unconsciousness. And if I refuse the coaching? Then I'll find you a perfect match on paper, and you'll bore her to tears talking about tax reform on your first date, and we'll be right back where we started. Your choice, Your Majesty. George was quiet for a moment, studying her with those ancient gray eyes. Emma forced herself to meet his gaze, even though her heart was hammering and her hands were sweating. Very well, he said finally. I'll agree to your terms, with one addition of my own. What's that? You get full access to my life, my schedule, my household, my daily routine. If you're going to find me a proper match, you need to actually know who I am, not just what's in some file. Emma nodded slowly. That was actually reasonable and unusual. Most clients wanted to maintain some distance, some mystery. They didn't want their matchmakers seeing their messy reality. Agreed, she said. Anything else? Yes. When you find the right person, you'll help me win her, properly. I don't want to just acquire a bride like a political transaction. I want to actually earn her affection. I want her to choose me because she wants to, not because her family negotiated a contract. There was something in his voice, something almost vulnerable, that caught Emma off guard. This wasn't just a king looking for a convenient alliance. This was a man who wanted something real. That's what I do best, she said softly. I help people find real connections, not just contracts or arrangements. Real love. Good. George stood, and Emma quickly stood as well. He was tall. She had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. When do we start? How about tomorrow? I'll shadow you for a few days, observe your routine, get to know you. Then we'll do a practice date so I can see exactly what we're working with. A practice date? Trust me, Emma said. You desperately need one. George laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine. I believe you. Tomorrow, then. My assistant will arrange everything. Emma gathered her still wrinkled papers and turned to leave, trying to exit with more dignity than she'd entered. She made it halfway to the door before George called out. Miss Hartwell? She turned back. Yes? Thank you for being honest with me. Most people are too afraid. Emma smiled despite herself. Most people didn't just faceplant in front of you while inventing the word majesty. I think my dignity already died here today. Might as well be honest. George's laugh followed her all the way out of the throne room, and Emma found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this job might actually be fun. She had no idea how right she was, or how complicated things were about to become. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma shadowed George Knight and took extensive notes. She learned quite a bit in those 14 days. For instance, George memorized the names of every single servant in his castle and asked about their families. He alphabetized his enormous library, but kept his favorite books at eye level, even though it ruined his organizational system. He hummed when he thought no one was listening, off-key and completely unself-conscious. He left bowls of cream out for the castle cats, even though he pretended he didn't like them. He was, Emma discovered, a much better person than he was a romantic. That needed to change. She also noticed something else. Something that made her chest feel tight. When George returned to his private chambers each evening, the castle felt different. Empty. She'd watched him one night from a corridor. He'd stood at his window looking out at nothing in particular, and the silence around him seemed almost heavy, like he was drowning in it. How long had it been since anyone had actually kept him company? Not servants performing duties, not advisors discussing politics, but genuine companionship. Emma pushed the thought away. She was here to find him a wife, not psychoanalyze his loneliness. For the practice date, Emma recruited her assistant to pretend to be interested in George romantically. They set up a nice dinner in one of the castle's smaller dining rooms. Candlelight, flowers, soft music playing in the background. The whole romantic setup. Emma hid behind a decorative plant in the corner to observe and take notes. It was a catastrophe from the very first sentence. George, clearly attempting to start with a compliment, looked across the table and said, "Your dress is adequate." Emma watched her assistant's face freeze in polite confusion. She whispered urgently from behind her plant, "Compliment her. Actually compliment her." George tried again, his brow furrowing with concentration. "I mean, the stitching is very competent. Quality craftsmanship. You can really see the attention to detail in the hemwork." Emma's assistant smiled uncertainly. Thank you?" "Yes," George continued, apparently thinking he was on a roll now. "My second wife's dresses were far inferior. The seamstress she used had terrible attention to detail. The hemming was always uneven, and the—" Emma facepalmed so hard she actually knocked the decorative plant over. It crashed to the floor with a tremendous noise, dirt spilling everywhere across the pristine floor. The practice date came to an abrupt halt. Emma's assistant excused herself shortly after, practically fleeing the room. Emma couldn't blame her. When they were alone, Emma emerged from behind the fallen plant, brushing dirt off her skirt. "So," she said, "we have a lot of work to do." George looked genuinely confused. "What did I do wrong? I complimented her dress." "No, you gave her dress a performance review. And then you compared her to your dead wife. Your dead wife, George." "I was trying to indicate that she was superior to—" "Stop!" Emma held up a hand. "New rule. Never, ever mention your ex-wives on a date. Actually, let's address this now. How many wives have you had?" "3. Emma's eyes widened. 3? How many are still alive? None. How did they die? Emma wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer, but she needed to understand what she was working with. George paused, then gestured to the table. Perhaps we should sit for this conversation. And I'll need wine brought up. I'll need the whole bottle, Emma muttered. Over wine, a very good wine from George's personal collection, they had a longer conversation. Did you love them? Emma asked quietly. Your wives? George was silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass, watching the dark liquid catch the candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I cared for them. I provided for them, ensured they were comfortable and safe, mourned them genuinely when they passed. The first wife, Margaret, I married when I was newly turned, barely a century old. I thought I was supposed to marry, so I did. She was kind. We had pleasant conversations. She died of fever after 30 years together, and I felt sad, but not devastated. He paused, took a sip of wine. The second, Beatrice, was a political arrangement. Her family needed protection. I needed territory. We lived together for 40 years. She was intelligent, good company. When she passed in her sleep, I mourned appropriately, gave her a proper funeral, moved on within a year. And the third? Emma asked gently. Catherine. That was 200 years ago. She was adventurous, spirited. The bear incident was... He crops his head. That was genuine tragedy. I felt angry about her death, guilty that I hadn't protected her better. But even then, he looked up at Emma, his gray eyes honest and a little lost. Even then, I'm not sure what I felt was love. Not real love. Emma waited, sensing he had more to say. I've been married 3 times over 6 centuries, Emma. I went through all the motions: courtship, wedding ceremonies, shared lives, funerals. But love? He's setting down his wine glass. I don't think I ever truly loved any of them. Not the way you're supposed to love a wife. They were arrangements, companionship, duty, pleasant partnerships. But my heart never... He pressed a hand to his chest. I never felt it here. Not really. That's incredibly sad, Emma said softly. It is, George agreed. I think I've been emotionally dead for centuries. Just going through motions, performing what I thought I was supposed to feel. That's why when you asked if I know what love feels like, he looked at her directly. I genuinely don't know. I can't remember ever experiencing it. If I ever did, it was so long ago, maybe when I was still human, that it's completely gone now. Emma's heart ached for him. 600 years of existence, 3 marriages, and not one moment of real, genuine love. Then that's what we'll do, she said firmly, pushing past the tightness in her throat. Before I introduce you to candidates, we're going to teach you how to fall in love again. Or maybe for the first time in centuries. Consider it research. George looked skeptical. How do you teach someone to fall in love? You don't teach them to fall in love with a specific person. You teach them how to be open to it, how to actually see people instead of just observing them, how to connect, how to be vulnerable, how to feel things instead of just going through appropriate motions. Emma leaned forward. Love isn't a transaction or a checklist or a duty you perform. It's about noticing 7 things, being prospects, letting yourself actually feel. Where's going to? Practice all of that. This sounds significantly more complicated than conquering kingdoms. It is, Emma said. But you're 623 years old. If you can learn to rule empires and survive centuries, you can learn this. George raised his glass with a slight smile. 2 complicated lessons, then. Emma clinked her glass against his. To teaching a vampire king how to be human again. Or maybe, for the first time. Over the next month, Emma created a series of exercises designed to teach George the fundamentals of connection. The first exercise was called Notice Small Things. Emma took George to the village market on a bright afternoon. The square was bustling with activity, vendors calling out their wares, children running between stalls, the smell of fresh bread and flowers filling the air. Pick someone, Emma instructed. Anyone. Now tell me 3 things you notice about them. George pointed to a woman selling bread at a nearby stall. She's approximately 40 years old, selling bread, has flour on her apron, appears to be doing steady business based on the number of customers. No, Emma interrupted. Don't just observe her like a military report. Notice her. What's she doing? What does it tell you about who she is? George watched more carefully. The baker was handing a loaf to a small boy who clearly didn't have enough coins in his outstretched palm. She wrapped the bread anyway, smiling warmly and saying something that made the child grin before he ran off. She's giving extra bread to children who can't afford full loaves, George said slowly. She's pretending she miscounted, so they don't feel like it's charity. Emma beamed. There you go! That's noticing. That's actually seeing someone, not just looking at them. They spent the afternoon people-watching. George began to see things he'd never noticed before. Tiny kindnesses, small gestures, the details that made people beautifully, imperfectly human. A father adjusting his daughter's ribbon with gentle patience, getting it wrong twice before she laughed and fixed it herself. An elderly couple walking hand in hand, their steps synchronized from decades together, neither needing to speak. A young woman helping a stranger reach something on a high shelf, both laughing when they succeeded together. At the end of the afternoon, Emma asked casually, "So, what did you notice about me today?" George didn't hesitate. You paid for that little girl's sweetbread an hour ago when her mother was counting coins. You did the same miscount trick as the baker, so neither of them would feel embarrassed. And you've done this before, many times. It's not spontaneous kindness. It's who you are. Emma felt her cheeks warm. That's just research. You know, for understanding human nature, for my job. Of course, George said, but there was a knowing smile on his face that made Emma's heart skip. The second exercise happened a week later and was about genuine compliments. They were in George's study, and Emma had decided on direct practice. Compliment me, she said without preamble. Right now. George looked thoughtful. Your business acumen is quite impressive. You've built a successful enterprise from very little capital, and your client retention rate suggests excellent interpersonal skills and— Stop. Emma shook her head. That's a performance review for a job interview, not a compliment. Try again. You're very organized? Your filing system is remarkably efficient. I'm going to die alone, Emma muttered to herself. Okay, watch and learn. She turned to a servant who was arranging flowers nearby. Excuse me, I just wanted to say I love how you arranged those flowers this morning. The way you mixed the roses with the wildflowers. It's creative and beautiful, and it shows you don't just follow rules. You make things better with your own touches. The servant's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Oh, thank you, miss. That's very kind of you to notice. After the servant left, Emma turned back to George. See? It's not about saying pretty words or formal phrases. It's about noticing what makes someone special and telling them you see it. And it has to be genuine. You have to actually mean it. George studied Emma for a long moment, his gray eyes serious and intent. Your laugh is too loud for polite society, he said finally. Emma's smile dropped instantly. Wow, thanks so much. That's really— I wasn't finished. George held up a hand. Your laugh is too loud for polite society, and I've started noticing when you're not laughing, because rooms feel colder without it. Everything feels less alive when you're quiet. I forms myself saying things just to hear you laugh, and I've never cared about making anyone laugh before. Emma forgot how to breathe for a second. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. George continued, completely oblivious to the effect his words were having. Was that better? More genuine? Yes, Emma managed, her voice coming out slightly strangled. That was perfect. Gold star, A+. Let's move on to the next exercise. She needed to move on before she did something stupid, like reading too much into what was clearly just a practice compliment. The third exercise was called shared silence. Emma brought 2 cups of tea to the castle garden at sunset. The garden was beautiful this time of day. Golden light filtering through the leaves, birds singing their evening songs, the scent of roses heavy in the warm air. Sit, she instructed, settling onto a stone bench. George sat beside her, looking puzzled. What are we doing? We're going to sit, in silence, together. That's the entire exercise? Being comfortable in silence with someone is one of the most intimate things you can do, Emma explained. Most people can't do it. They fill every gap with words because silence feels awkward or uncomfortable. But with the right person, silence can be peaceful, companionable, even joyful. So just be here, with me, quietly. George looked skeptical, but agreed to try. The first few minutes were awkward. He fidgeted, adjusted his position on the bench, cleared his throat unnecessarily. But gradually, he settled. He watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple. He listened to the birds singing. He noticed Emma close her eyes and smile at the evening breeze ruffling her hair. 20 minutes passed in comfortable silence. Finally, Emma spoke softly. See? Not everything has to be perfect, or planned, or purposeful. Sometimes love is just being quiet together, and it being enough. George realized something profound in that moment. Sitting on this bench, listening to birdsong, with this woman beside him in comfortable silence, he'd never felt this peaceful in decades. Maybe centuries. He couldn't remember the last time silence had felt like companionship instead of loneliness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For teaching me that silence doesn't have to be empty." Emma opened her eyes and looked at him. The sunset made her eyes look warm and golden, and George felt something shift in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. "You're welcome," she said softly. Neither of them moved from the bench for another half hour, and neither of them needed to speak again. The silence said everything. As part of George's education in romance, Emma decided he needed real-world practice. Not with actual candidates yet, he wasn't ready for that kind of pressure. But practice outings to build his confidence and skills. These outings were, without exception, absolutely chaotic. The first practice outing was to the City Museum. Emma thought it would be perfect. Cultural, sophisticated, plenty of conversation starters. What she didn't account for was that George had lived through most of the history on display and had very strong opinions about historical accuracy. The museum guide gestured enthusiastically at an ancient vase in a display case. "This beautiful piece is believed to be from the 1400s. Scholars think it was created somewhere in northern Italy." 1432 specifically. George interrupted. "Florence. The artist was named Thomas." The tour guide blinked. Actually, we're not certain of the exact..." "I'm certain. I commissioned it." Emma grabbed George's arm and pulled him away from the bewildered guide before he could elaborate on how he'd been alive in 1432. "Stop showing off your immortal knowledge," she hissed. "You're supposed to be learning how to have a normal date, not proving you're 600 years old." "But the information on the placard was completely wrong." "Nobody cares. Let the museum be wrong. This is practice for being personable, not accurate." George looked genuinely confused by this concept, as if the idea of letting incorrect information stand was physically painful. They didn't make it through the rest of the museum tour. Emma dragged him out before he could correct any more historical inaccuracies or accidentally reveal he'd personally known half the people depicted in the paintings. The second practice outing was to the theater. Emma handed George a list of basic rules before they entered. Don't talk during the performance. Don't leave at intermission. Don't critique the historical accuracy. Just enjoy it. George lasted approximately 20 minutes. At what was clearly meant to be an emotional climax, the hero appearing to die in his lover's arms, George leaned over to Emma and said at full volume, "He's not actually dead. The actor is still breathing. Look, you can see his chest moving." Several people turned to shush him. Emma wanted to sink through her seat into the floor. "It's pretend," she hissed. "That's how plays work." "It's not very realistic." "It's not supposed to be a documentary." At intermission, George stood up to leave. "Where are you going?" Emma grabbed his arm. "The play's over." "No, there's a whole second act." George looked genuinely surprised. Why would they make it longer? The story could have been told efficiently in one act. By the time the play actually ended, with George whispering periodic commentary about historical inaccuracies and unrealistic sword choreography, Emma was ready to sink into the earth and never return. In the lobby afterward, George looked thoughtful. "I didn't enjoy that as much as I expected to," he admitted. "You don't say," Emma replied dryly. "But I enjoyed arguing about it with you afterward. That was entertaining." Despite her exasperation, Emma smiled. "Yeah?" "Yes. You're much more interesting than the play was. Your reactions were genuine. The actors were just performing." Emma's heart did a tiny, unwelcome flip. "Well, thanks, I think." The third and final practice outing was ice skating. This was Emma's idea. Something lighthearted and fun, a chance for George to be playful instead of serious and analytical. "I've never ice skated," George admitted as they laced up their rental skates. "That's fine. You're a vampire. Don't you have supernatural balance and coordination?" "On solid ground, yes." "Then you'll be great at this." He was spectacularly wrong. Vampires, it turned out, had excellent balance on surfaces that didn't move. Ice was a completely different situation. George stepped onto the ice with confidence, took 2 gliding steps, and immediately went down hard on his back. Emma, who was wobbly but managing to stay upright by clutching the railing, stared down at him in shock. "I thought you had supernatural coordination." "I do, on surfaces that don't slide." George tried to stand. His feet went in opposite directions, and he went down again. Emma started laughing. She couldn't help it. The great vampire king, conqueror of kingdoms, commander of armies, repeatedly defeated by frozen water. George looked up at her, dignity clearly wounded. "This isn't funny." "It's a little funny," Emma said, laughing harder. George attempted to stand again with exaggerated care. His feet slipped. Down he went. Emma was now laughing so hard she had tears streaming down her face and had to let go of the railing to clutch her stomach. "Oh my God, stop! You're going to hurt yourself." "I'm immortal. I can't hurt myself. My pride, however, is very mortal right now." "Your pride is definitely taking damage." George looked up at her laughing face, tears on her cheeks, completely uninhibited joy radiating from her, and something shifted in his expression. The wounded dignity melted away, replaced by something mischievous. The next time he fell, it was clearly, deliberately on purpose. He went down in an exaggerated tumble, arms windmilling dramatically like a cartoon character. Emma laughed even harder, the sound echoing across the ice rink. Encouraged, George kept falling in increasingly ridiculous ways. Each fall was more dramatic than the last, spinning, stumbling, sliding across the ice on his back. And each time, Emma's laughter rang out, bright and genuine and perfect. Other skaters were staring, but neither of them cared. Financial, Emma tried to skate over to help him up and lost her own balance. She crashed into him with a yelp, and they ended up in a tangled heap on the ice, both laughing like children. "This is ridiculous," Emma gasped between laughs, tears of mirth streaming down her face. "This is perfect," George said, and he meant it with his whole heart. They lay on the ice for another minute, catching their breath, surrounded by confused skaters gliding gracefully past them. And for just that moment, George wasn't a vampire king. He wasn't 623 years old. He wasn't carrying the weight of a kingdom and impossible political expectations. He was just a guy, lying on the ice, laughing with someone who made everything feel lighter. That's when Emma realized she was in serious trouble. Because somewhere between the museum corrections and the theater whispers and the ice rink disasters that somehow felt perfect, somewhere between the compliment exercises and the shared silences and the way he looked at her when she laughed, she'd started falling for him. Her client, the vampire king, the man she was literally being paid to match with someone else. This was bad. This was very, very bad. But as George helped her up from the ice, his hand warm and solid in hers despite the cold, both of them still laughing and breathless, Emma couldn't bring herself to care about professional boundaries or common sense. At least, not in that moment. After 6 weeks of coaching and practice, Emma decided George was finally ready. It was time to introduce him to actual candidates, real women who might actually become his queen and save the political alliance the kingdom desperately needed. She'd carefully selected 3 exceptional women from her database. Each one was perfect on paper. Intelligent, accomplished, politically well-connected, beautiful. Any one of them would make an excellent vampire queen and secure the Southern Alliance. Emma told herself she was being professional, that the tight feeling in her chest when she confirmed the first date was just anxiety about her success rate, that the way her stomach dropped when she helped George prepare had nothing to do with jealousy. She was a professional. She'd done this hundreds of times. She could handle this. The first candidate was Lady Victoria Ashmore, beautiful in a classical way. Elegant features, perfect posture, the kind of grace that came from generations of aristocratic breeding. She was intelligent, well-read, and had impeccable manners. Her family's connections to the Southern territories were exactly what the kingdom needed. On paper, she was absolutely perfect for George. Emma helped him prepare for the date, coaching him through conversation topics, reminding him of everything they'd practiced over the past 6 weeks. "Remember," she said, straightening his collar even though it didn't need straightening, "actually listen to what she says. Ask follow-up questions. Notice small things about her. And for the love of everything, do not mention tax policy or your dead wives." "I know," George said patiently. "You've told me this approximately 17 times. I'm telling you an 18th time because I know you, and you get nervous and fall back on familiar topics when you're uncomfortable." George smiled slightly. "You do know me, don't you?" There was something in his voice that made Emma's heart skip, but she ignored it. She had to ignore it. "Go," she said, stepping back. "Be charming. You can do this." The date went well. Emma knew because she'd insisted on observing from a discreet distance. Quality control, she'd told George, though really she just couldn't bear not knowing how it was going. She watched from a balcony overlooking the restaurant. George used all her techniques perfectly. He complimented Victoria genuinely, commenting on her insightful observations rather than her appearance. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions. He listened attentively. He didn't mention tax policy even once. Victoria was clearly charmed, laughing at his dry humor, leaning forward with interest, touching his arm lightly during conversation. It was perfect. Textbook perfect. Emma felt physically sick. After the date ended, Victoria leaving with promises to see him again soon, George found Emma waiting in the garden. "That went well," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Emma forced enthusiasm into her voice. "It did! She's wonderful. Perfect, really. Exactly what you need. Beautiful, intelligent, excellent family connections. The advisors will be thrilled." She was lovely, George agreed, but there was something off in his voice. "But," Emma heard the hesitation. "But she didn't really laugh. At my jokes, I mean." "You made jokes?" "I tried that. Humorous observation technique you taught me. Several times." "And?" She smiled politely. Very politely. Very controlled. George looked frustrated. It wasn't like when you laugh. You throw your head back and you don't care who hears you. She was very proper." Emma told herself the warm feeling in her chest meant absolutely nothing. "Well, not everyone has my ridiculous, too loud laugh," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "No," George said quietly, looking directly at her. "They don't." The second candidate was Lady Helena Cross, brilliant, accomplished, with advanced degrees in literature and philosophy. Quick-witted, well-traveled, the kind of intellectual match Emma thought George desperately needed. This date went even better than the first. Emma watched them discuss poetry and philosophy, their conversation flowing naturally from topic to topic. Helena challenged George intellectually, debated points with him, made him think deeply about subjects he cared about. It was exactly what Emma had told him he needed. Someone who could match his centuries of knowledge and keep him mentally engaged. After Helena left, clearly interested in seeing George again, Emma asked how it went. "She's remarkable," George said genuinely. "Truly intelligent. I enjoyed our conversation immensely. It's rare to find someone who can discuss Aristotle and still surprise me with new perspectives." But, again, that word was there, hanging in the air. "But she doesn't really challenge me. Not the way you do." "She literally just debated philosophy with you for 2 hours. "She debated beautifully," George clarified. "But she always conceded in the end, always deferred to my opinion eventually. You never do that. You'll argue a point for an hour just because you believe you're right, even when I have 6 centuries of experience on the topic." "That's called being stubborn," Emma said. "It's not actually a good quality in a partner." "I disagree," George said firmly. "I like that you're stubborn. I like that you tell me when I'm wrong. Which is often, apparently." "Most people would find that annoying." "Then I'm not most people." The third candidate was Duchess Catherine Wells, the absolute perfect political match. Her family's alliance would stabilize the entire southern region, secure trade routes, and guarantee peace for decades. She was everything the kingdom needed in a queen: diplomatic, sophisticated, experienced in navigating complex royal politics. She was, quite literally, the answer to all of the kingdom's problems. George took her to the castle garden for their date, Emma's suggestion to show her something he loved and cared about. The date was textbook perfect. Emma watched from a window in the castle, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, trying to breathe normally. Catherine admired the roses with genuine appreciation, asked thoughtful questions about the garden's history and design, complimented the careful landscaping. George was the perfect host, attentive, charming, knowledgeable, exactly as Emma had taught him to be. Watching him be perfect for someone else was physically painful. After Catherine left, with clear interest in seeing George again and excited mention of introducing him to her family, he found Emma in her small office in the castle. She was staring at her notes, not really seeing the words on the page. "That was the best one yet," George said from the doorway. Emma didn't look up. Her voice came out too bright, too false. "Great. Wonderful. So, should I start planning the engagement party? Catherine's family connections are exactly what the kingdom needs. The advisors will be ecstatic." "She was perfect," George agreed. "Everything you said I needed. Politically connected, diplomatically skilled, genuinely kind." "But—" Emma finally looked at him, and she couldn't keep the pain out of her eyes. George stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "But she's not you." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Emma's heart stopped. "What?" George moved closer, and Emma could see he looked almost tortured. "Every woman you've introduced me to, I've compared to you. I didn't mean to. I tried not to, but I couldn't help it." Emma would have laughed at that. Emma would have argued this point. Emma would have noticed that the roses need watering. "You've completely ruined me for anyone else." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's just because we've spent so much time together over the past 2 months. Once you're married to Catherine, you'll forget all about—" "I don't want to forget about you." "George." "I'm 623 years old, Emma. I know the difference between proximity and love. I know what I feel. This isn't confusion or transference or anything else you're about to say." Emma felt panic rising in her chest, sharp and choking. "You can't love me. I'm your matchmaker. This is textbook client transference. It's completely normal. It happens all the time. You're just confused because I've been helping you and—" "I'm not confused." "You can't love me." Emma's voice cracked, and tears started streaming down her face. "Look at me, George. Really look at me. I'm not queen material. I'm clumsy and loud, and I can't fit into royal gowns, and I don't know which fork to use at fancy dinners. And I tripped and fell flat on my face the first time I met you, and I knocked over a plant during your practice date, and I'm just me. I'm not elegant or poised or politically connected or anything a queen should be." "And you make me laugh," George interrupted gently, stepping closer. "And you see me as a person, not a crown or a political asset. and you challenge me to be better every single day. And when you're not around, I notice. Everything feels emptier. The castle feels colder. Food tastes like nothing. Not that I eat it, but metaphorically, everything is just less without you. Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. You need someone worthy of being your queen. George crossed the room and took her hands in his touch gentle. You are worthy. You're more than worthy. You're everything. Your kingdom needs a political alliance. Catherine's family can give you that. Without this marriage, the southern territories will close trade routes. Political tensions will escalate. Everything could fall apart. My kingdom needs a king who actually cares about ruling it, instead of just going through the motions for 6 centuries, George said firmly. You've made me want to be present again. You've made me want to be better. You've reminded me what it feels like to be human. That's worth more than any political alliance could ever be. Emma shook her head desperately, pulling her hands away. I can't be what you need. You already are. No. Emma stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. No, this is my job. You hired me to find you a queen. I found you 3 perfect options. Pick one of them and let me go. Please. Emma. Please. She was openly sobbing now, her voice breaking. Please, just let me go. Pay me for the contract and let me leave. I can't do this. George looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something break in his expression. Pain and understanding and resignation all at once. If that's what you want, he said quietly. It is. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. They both knew it was a lie. But George stepped back, giving her the space she'd asked for. I'll have someone process your contract payment. You'll have the money by tomorrow. Consider the contract fulfilled. You found me my match. I just didn't choose the one you expected. Emma nodded, unable to speak past the tears. She left the castle that night and didn't look back, but she cried the entire way home, and she didn't stop crying for 3 days. On the 4th day, Emma heard the news. George Knight, Vampire King of the Northern Territories, had made a public announcement. He was calling off all courtships with the noble candidates. There would be no political marriage to the Southern Territories, no alliance. Instead, he'd chosen someone else entirely. Her. Emma heard about it from a former client who called her office, excited and confused. Then from 3 more people. Then she saw it in the morning paper. Vampire King chooses love over alliance, selects common matchmaker as future queen. Emma's first emotion was pure, incandescent rage. She stormed into the castle. No appointment, no announcement, just marched right past the startled guards who knew better than to try to stop an angry woman on a mission. She burst into the throne room where George was meeting with his advisors. They all jumped at her entrance. You! Emma shouted, pointing at George with a shaking finger. The advisors scrambled backward. George just looked at her calmly, like he'd been expecting this. Miss Hartwell, I was wondering when you'd arrive. You don't get to do this! Emma was shaking with anger. You don't get to just announce we're together without asking me, without even talking to me first. I left. I walked away. That was me saying no. You're absolutely right, George said, standing and descending the steps from his throne. I should have asked first. I apologize. Emma stopped mid-rant, thrown off balance. You… what? I should have asked you before making any public announcements. That was wrong of me. So I'm asking now. He came to stand directly in front of her. Will you give me a chance to prove I'm serious about this? You can't just upend your entire kingdom for me. What about the Southern Alliance? What about trade routes and political stability and everything the advisors have been panicking about for months? I'm not upending anything. I'm choosing what I should have chosen from the beginning. Someone I actually love. Someone who makes me want to be a better king, not just go through the motions. You barely know me. Then let me know you better. Give me a chance, Emma. Please. Just one chance. Emma's anger was wavering, being rapidly replaced by fear. Deep, bone-shaking fear. This is insane. Probably, George agreed readily. But you taught me that the best things are a little insane. Like ice skating when you're immortal, or laughing too loud in theaters, or falling in love with your matchmaker when you are supposed to be finding a political bride. Emma felt tears threatening again. You're impossible. I'm in love with you. There's a significant difference. George, I can't. One chance, he said, his voice gentle but firm. If you still think this is a mistake after I've proven myself, I'll let you go. I'll marry Catherine Wells, secure the alliance, and never bother you again. But please, give me one chance to prove this is real. Emma looked at him, this impossible, immortal, infuriating man who'd somehow worked his way into her heart despite every professional boundary and logical objection. Fine, she said finally, her voice shaking. One chance. But if you want to prove this is real, you have to show up for the boring stuff. Not grand gestures or public declarations or dramatic proposals. Real life. Normal, boring, everyday moments. Done, George said immediately. I mean it. No sweeping romantic gestures, no expensive gifts. Just show up. For the mundane, unsexy, boring parts of life. I understand. Real life. Normal moments. I can do that. Emma didn't believe him. Vampire kings didn't do normal. But she wanted to believe him. Okay, she said. Prove it. The next morning, Emma woke to someone in her kitchen. She screamed. George looked up from the stove, completely unbothered by her reaction. He was wearing a frilly apron she'd never seen before. Good morning. I'm making breakfast. Emma stared at him, still in her pajamas, her hair an absolute disaster. What are you doing in my apartment? How did you even get in here? You mentioned weeks ago that you always skip breakfast because you're rushing in the mornings. I thought I'd make you breakfast. And your landlord let me in. I may have paid your rent for the next year. You're welcome. You… what? You can't just… Emma stopped. You don't even eat food. No, but you do. Emma walked closer and looked at what he'd created on her stove. It was an absolute disaster. The eggs were somehow both undercooked and overcooked at the same time, existing in a state that defied the laws of cooking. The toast was burnt black on one side and completely pale on the other. There was a mysterious substance in a pan that might have once been bacon, but now looked like charcoal. "This is terrible," Emma said honestly. "I know," George admitted without shame. "I've never cooked in 600 years. But you said show up for the normal moments. This is me showing up, even though I have no idea what I'm doing." Emma felt something crack in her chest, warm and painful and overwhelming. He'd burnt her breakfast. He'd broken into her apartment with her landlord's help. He looked absolutely ridiculous, standing in her tiny kitchen in his expensive clothes and a frilly apron. And it was perfect. She started laughing, then crying, then laughing again while crying. "Are you all right?" George asked, genuinely concerned. "I'm eating this terrible breakfast," Emma declared, sitting down at her small table. "You don't have to. I'm eating it. Every bite." She did. Every bite of the terrible eggs and the burnt toast and the mysterious bacon substance that crunched in ways bacon shouldn't crunch. It was objectively the worst meal she'd ever had. It was also the best, because of what it meant. Over the next 2 weeks, George proved himself in small, ordinary ways. He showed up at her office one afternoon. "You need groceries. I'm taking you shopping." Watching George navigate a modern grocery store was the most entertaining thing Emma had ever witnessed. He was baffled by shopping carts, scandalized by prices, tried to pay with gold coins, and got into an actual argument with the self-checkout machine about its user-hostile interface. Emma laughed until her sides hurt. 1 week later, her sink broke at 2 a.m. She texted George without thinking. "Sink exploded. Water everywhere." 10 minutes later, he was at her door with a toolbox. "You came," she said. "You called. You needed help. That's how this works. You show up, even at 2 a.m, even for broken sinks." He fixed it while she sat on the bathroom floor watching him, and she realized he meant every word. He met her friends at their weekly gathering, uninvited but welcomed. They interrogated him thoroughly. "What are your intentions with Emma?" "To make her laugh every day, fix her sink when it breaks, and show up for every boring moment for as long as she'll let me." Her friends approved. 2 weeks later, Emma had the worst day. Clients canceled, rent increased despite George having paid it. Her car broke down. She spilled coffee on her favorite dress. She didn't call him. He showed up anyway at 6 p.m. "How did you know?" "You didn't send me your usual good morning text. I knew something was wrong." Emma burst into tears. He held her without trying to fix anything. When she stopped crying, he asked, "What do you need?" "Ice cream and bad TV." They spent the night on her couch. She fell asleep on his shoulder. He stayed perfectly still for 4 hours so he wouldn't wake her. When Emma woke in the morning, there was a blanket over her and George was still there, reading one-handed. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed. Where else would I go?" Emma looked up at him, this impossible man who'd sat still for hours, who'd learned to make terrible breakfast, who showed up for every boring, normal, imperfect moment. "I love you," she said. George's smile could have lit the world. "I love you too. I've been waiting for you to realize it." "Since when?" "The ice skating. Maybe before. Definitely by the time you ate my terrible breakfast." Emma laughed. "George, Yes? I'm still going to be a disaster at being queen. I'm counting on it. You'll make everything better by being exactly who you are. You really mean that? I really mean that. Emma kissed him. It wasn't perfect. She was morning-breathed and rumpled and bonked his nose with her forehead. But it was real, and that made it perfect. George didn't propose with a grand gesture. He proposed on a random Wednesday evening 3 weeks later while doing dishes together in Emma's apartment. She'd cooked dinner, pasta with jarred sauce and too much garlic. He'd insisted on cleaning up. They stood side by side at her tiny sink, Emma washing and George drying when he said it. Marry me. Emma dropped a plate. It shattered in the sink. What? Marry me. Not because it's politically advantageous, not because you're perfect, because you make doing dishes feel important. Because I want to fix your sink at 2 a.m. for the rest of your life. Because I love you exactly as you are. Emma stared at him, holding a soapy sponge, water dripping. This is the least romantic proposal setting ever. I know. That's why it's perfect for us. So, what do you say? Yes, Emma said, crying. Obviously, yes. How could I say anything but yes? George put down his towel, took the sponge from her hand, and kissed her properly. They stood in her tiny kitchen, surrounded by broken plate pieces and dish soap, and it was absolutely perfect. Because perfect didn't mean flawless. Perfect meant real. Perfect meant them. Emma was officially queen. She was, as predicted, absolutely terrible at it. At her first royal banquet, she used the salad fork for the main course. When corrected, she whispered loudly, "There are too many forks. This is fork tyranny." She laughed too loudly at a visiting duke's joke. She accidentally called an earl dude. She spilled wine on her expensive gown and declared it an improvement. It was too boring before. George watched her with undisguised adoration. An advisor whispered, "Your Majesty, the Queen is highly unconventional." I know, George said, smiling. Isn't she wonderful? Life settled into a rhythm. George still made terrible breakfast every Tuesday. Emma still dragged him to grocery stores. They watched bad reality TV together. He fixed things in her apartment, which she'd kept despite being queen. The advisors hate that I kept it, Emma mentioned. The advisors hate many things about you. Your apartment, your informality, the fact that you still run your matchmaking business 3 days a week. Should I give it up? Absolutely not. You made a promise to your clients. Queens can change the rules. Emma still challenged him constantly, argued with his decisions, made him think harder, and he loved every second of it. One evening, 6 months after the wedding, they were in their private chambers during their quiet hour before bed. George read a history book. Emma did paperwork. I signed a document today as Queen Emma, she said. I still can't believe that's real. George didn't look up. You also drew a smiley face next to your signature. It was a tax document. It needed joy. George closed his book. You're absolutely ridiculous. You married me anyway. Best decision I've made in 623 years. Emma looked at him. This impossible man who'd learned to love through roses and disasters and terrible breakfasts. You know what's weird? What? This is my favorite part of every day. What part? This, right here. Just existing together. You reading, me working, nothing special happening. Just us being us. George put his book down. That's not weird at all. That's love. The boring parts. The normal parts. The parts where nothing happens except we're together, and that's enough. That's everything. Emma smiled. You've gotten very wise about love, Your Majesty. I had an excellent teacher. Oh yeah? What happened to her? I married her. She still uses the wrong fork and draws smiley faces on official documents, but I'm learning to accept it. Slowly. Emma threw her pen at him. He caught it with vampire reflexes. She tackled him anyway, and they ended up tangled on their couch, laughing like teenagers. Down the hall, an advisor shook his head at the Queen's too loud laughter echoing through the castle. But he was smiling. The kingdom had never been happier. The Southern Territories had been initially furious about the canceled alliance, but Emma's unconventional diplomacy, treating their ambassador like a person, inviting him to family dinners, asking about his children, had won them over. Her way worked better than a marriage contract ever would have. The Vampire King had never been more present, more engaged with ruling. And Emma had learned she wasn't unmatchable at all. She'd just been waiting for someone who would show up for broken sinks and terrible breakfasts and boring Wednesdays. Someone who saw her exactly as she was and loved her not despite it, but because of it. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up for imperfect moments and choosing each other anyway. It was about ice skating disasters and grocery store arguments and dishes done side by side. It was about little moments that became everything. And that's exactly what Emma and George had built. A lifetime of little moments. A forever of boring Wednesdays. A love that was real, precisely because it was imperfect. And that was worth more than any perfect match could ever be.